What really happened in a medieval battle? Not the movie version, the real one. No slow-mammered sword fights, no perfect armor, no heroic music. Just the truth as it was. If you've ever been curious about what it was actually like, it's time to find out. For starters, if you were an average soldier, you probably couldn't even hear the signal to attack. The guy with the horn, he was usually somewhere safe, far from the actual fighting. Smart move on his part. Medieval horn players had the highest life expectancy in the army, right behind the kings who started the wars. In the first 15 seconds of battle, nearly half the front line would trip on their own feet or their comrades. Medieval battlefields weren't neat parade grounds. They were muddy fields with hidden routes waiting to send you face first into the dirt. You'd flail like a fool, your war cry choking into a grunt as you ate mud, praying no one saw your stumble. You didn't charge like heroes in stories. You shuffled forward in a nervous mass, your knees weak from standing in formation for hours. The man next to you breathed heavily, stinking of garlic and fear. Medieval breath mints weren't a thing, which might explain why soldiers yelled so much. It was the only way to breathe without smelling your battle buddy's lunch. Everyone shouted, but nobody could tell you exactly what they were yelling. Most men just screamed to push down their terror. Studies show that in combat, about 70% of men make involuntary noises they don't even remember afterward. If you could translate most medieval battle cries, they'd probably come out to something like, "Mom, help, I regret everything." Your voice cracked, a pathetic squeak lost in the din, as you realized you'd rather be anywhere but here. Then came the first hit. Someone slammed into your shield. Your ears rang, but you couldn't tell if it was from the blow or from the man who just headbutted you. The jolt rattled your teeth, your arm screaming in protest, as you wondered if it'd ever stop shaking. The noise was deafening. Not heroic battle music, but a wall of grunts, screams, and metal striking metal or flesh. Your arm vibrated so hard from blocking that hit, your grandchildren would be born with the shakes. 2 minutes in, your grand battle plan was reduced to one simple goal: stay upright. Falling meant death from the weight of other men stepping on you. The ground became slick with blood and vomit. Your arms ached from holding up your shield. The sun beat down, cooking you inside your padded gambeson. Medieval armor, the world's least comfortable portable sauna. The only weight loss program where you might lose 15 pounds of sweat, or your head, whichever comes first. You gasped for air, your lungs burning, as the heat made you question if death might be cooler. Your world shrank to the few feet around you. You just saw the terrified eyes of the man opposite you, who was just as confused as you were. His gaze locked with yours, a silent plea for mercy, both of you knowing only one might walk away. In that moment, you both silently agreed that whoever told you the battle was glorious deserved a special place in hell. And all this was just the beginning. If you survived the initial clash, you'd face the next brutal reality of battle. Real medieval combat looked more like a violent rugby scrum than a fencing match. Fighters didn't square off one-on-one. They ganged up whenever possible. 5 against 1 was considered good strategy, not poor sportsmanship. Warriors like Baldric didn't follow a code of honor in battle. They followed the "I want to go home alive" code, which trumped everything else. The crush of bodies made proper sword technique nearly impossible. You had about 6 in of space to move your weapon. You couldn't do those big dramatic sword arcs when pressed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow soldiers. Your elbow jammed into your neighbor's ribs, your sword useless as you fumbled in the crush. Most sword fights involved awkwardly jabbing your blade forward, like you were trying to poke someone on a crowded subway car. Swords were rarely the killing blow anyway. According to battlefield grave analysis, most fatal wounds came from downward strikes to the top of the skull or neck. Exactly what would happen when someone fell and others piled on. Medieval battle strategy was less defeat your opponent fairly, and more, kick him when he's down, then kick him again, then maybe once more for luck. The pommel of your sword, that heavy metal knob at the end of the handle, often proved more useful than the blade. Sword experts call this half-swording, or murder stroke technique, where you'd hold the blade and swing the handle like a hammer. This technique was called the murder stroke, which is probably the most honest name for any fighting move in history. You'd swing with desperate force, your hands slick, hoping the blow landed before your grip failed. Helmets saved lives, but created new problems. They limited vision to a narrow slit and turned your head into a metal oven under the sun. After just 20 minutes of fighting, the temperature inside a medieval helmet could reach over 100 deg. Sweat stung your eyes, your head throbbing, as you feared fainting before a blade found you. Many fighters died not from wounds, but from heat exhaustion. Medieval knights basically fought inside portable saunas, while people tried to kill them, making them either the bravest or most foolish humans in history. If you fell during this chaos, you had about 2 seconds to get up, not because of some rule, but because that's how long it took for boots to start trampling you, or weapons to find gaps in your armor. You'd claw at the ground, gasping as boots crushed your fingers, each second a fight for breath. Examination of medieval battle sites shows that many bodies were found face down in just inches of mud. Not dramatic deaths, just slow suffocation after falling. Wounds often came from unexpected angles. Your armor might stop a sword from the front, but what about the guy hitting you from behind or the side? A typical fighter received attacks from at least 3 different directions within any 1-minute period. Your head would spin trying to track all the threats, which is ironic since keeping your head from literally spinning off was the main goal. You'd twist wildly, heart pounding, knowing one missed dodge could be your last. The crushing, trampling, and disorientation took more lives than straight-up combat skills. If by some miracle you survived this chaotic dogpile, with all your limbs still attached, your next challenge would be dealing with whatever weapons came flying at you. The weapons of medieval battles weren't the gleaming masterpieces you see in museum displays. Most were rough tools designed for one purpose: breaking through whatever stood between you and your enemy's soft parts. Let's talk axes first. Battle axes weren't fancy. They were basically the same tool used for chopping wood, just modified to chop through shields, armor, and unfortunately, human bone. They had a major advantage. You didn't need much training to use one effectively. Swing hard, aim somewhat close to your target, and physics did the rest. The downside: once your axe bit into something, be it a wooden shield or someone's rib cage, it often got stuck. You'd pull with all your might, cursing, as the axe refused to budge, enemies circling like wolves. Medieval battlefield findings show that many axe wielders died while trying to yank their weapon free. An axe getting stuck in your enemy was the medieval equivalent of your phone dying at 99% battery. Frustrating and potentially deadly. Spears were the most common weapon on medieval battlefields, with some armies using them for up to 70% of their forces. Why? They were cheap to make and required minimal training. A simple wooden shaft with a metal point could be mass-produced easily, even by smaller kingdoms with limited resources. The real benefit was reach. You could stab someone from 6 feet away, while they were still trying to get close enough to hit you. The drawback was maneuverability. In tight formations, spears became more hazard than help. Battlefield records mention numerous accidental spear injuries to allies. You'd wince as an ally's spear nicked your shoulder, his clumsy thrust nearly costing you your life. Many medieval soldiers got poked more often by their friends' spears than by their enemies, a painful lesson in watching your back in the most literal sense. Maces solved a problem that swords couldn't: plate armor. As metal armor improved, slashing at it became useless. The solution? Stop cutting and start crushing. A mace was essentially a heavy metal ball on a stick designed to dent armor inward, breaking bones without needing to cut through metal. Simple, effective, and terrifying. Church records from the period show that many religious knights favored maces because they technically didn't shed blood, and thus didn't violate religious restrictions. Medieval logic at its finest. I can't cut you open, but I can turn your insides into pudding. God's totally fine with that. Swords get all the glory in stories, but they were actually the least common weapon on medieval battlefields. Why? They were expensive. Really expensive. A good sword could cost as much as a small house. They required special steel, skilled craftsmen, and years of training to use effectively. Only nobles and professional soldiers like Godric typically carried them. And contrary to movie magic, swords broke frequently. You'd gape in despair as your blade shattered, leaving you with a jagged stump as foes closed in. Analysis of battlefield swords shows that many had been repaired multiple times before their final use. Nothing ruins your heroic moment quite like your fancy sword snapping in half on the first swing, leaving you holding what amounts to a very expensive metal stick. Then, there were the improvised weapons, the desperate solutions of peasant armies and last resort fighters. Farm tools repurposed for war were remarkably common. Flails, grain threshing tools, pitchforks, and even sharpened shovels appeared regularly on medieval battlefields. Records from several major battles indicate up to 20% of common soldiers fought with modified farming equipment. These makeshift weapons often proved surprisingly effective, mainly because no one expected to be defeated by a gardening tool. You'd wield a flail with grim resolve, knowing a misstep could mean death by your own rusty plow. Death by shovel wasn't glorious, but it was just as final as death by sword, and considerably more embarrassing to explain in the afterlife. The craftsmanship of weapons varied wildly too. While kings and nobles wielded masterfully crafted pieces, most ordinary soldiers used mass-produced arms of questionable quality. Rust, loose handles, and improperly tempered metal were common problems. Many weapons failed during use, leaving their owners scrambling for alternatives. Your spear's shaft splintered mid-thrust, forcing you to grab a fallen blade, your hands shaking. As these crude weapons found their targets, medieval fighters quickly learned that armor didn't make them invincible, just slower when trying to escape. And the wounds these brutal tools left behind, they opened the door to a whole new level of battlefield horror. All those weapons we just talked about, they weren't designed to look cool. They were designed to tear through human bodies, and tear they did. Armor helped, but not as much as you'd think. Chainmail could stop a slashing sword once, maybe twice, but a direct hit from an axe or mace, that mail would fold right into your flesh, turning your protection into part of the wound. The pain seared like fire, your screams drowned out, as metal became one with your mangled flesh. Records from battlefield surgeons indicate that about 40% of armored knight casualties had shattered bones, despite their armor being intact. Armor was basically medieval bubble wrap. It could handle the first drop, but anything after that was just making crunchy noises as you broke. A hit to the shoulder might take the whole arm with it. Medieval weapons didn't make clean cuts. They tore, shredded, and mangled. Most fighters who lost limbs in battle didn't die from the injury itself, but from blood loss or the infection that followed. Blood loss happened far faster than in movies where heroes fight on despite multiple wounds. The human body contains roughly 10 pints of blood, and losing just 2 can cause unconsciousness. Records suggest that many soldiers bled out in under 5 minutes after major wounds. You'd clutch your side, blood gushing as the world faded, your life slipping through your fingers. Sometimes you didn't even know you were hit until your vision blurred and your knees gave out. Internal injuries from blunt weapons were actually worse than cuts. Nothing to stitch up, just pain and panic. A solid mace hit might not break the skin, but could rupture organs, crack ribs, or cause brain bleeding. Medieval doctors had a technical term for these hidden injuries: the "oh no, he was fine a minute ago" syndrome. Not every wound was dramatic. Teeth flew out when helmets took hits. Eyes got gouged by splinters from broken shields. Small wounds that today would need just a few stitches became life-threatening due to infection. Records from monastery hospitals show that for every soldier who died in battle, 3 more died afterward from wound infections. There were no medics waiting on the sidelines. The closest thing to battlefield medicine was other soldiers tying belts around wounded limbs to slow bleeding, or cauterizing wounds with heated dagger tips. The hot blade's burn made you howl, a torment you'd relive every time you closed your eyes. Medieval pain scales ranged from "I can still fight" to "please just kill me now," with very little in between. Field hospitals, when they existed at all, were usually just tents where the wounded were laid out on straw. Surgical tools weren't sterilized. They were maybe wiped on a cloth if you were lucky. Battlefield surgery success rates hovered around 30%, and most procedures involved amputation, not because it was always necessary, but because it was quick. You'd watch in horror as the saw bit into your leg, your screams echoing, knowing you'd never walk whole again. The mental trauma from these wounds often proved as devastating as the physical damage. Many survivors described feeling their minds fragment during battle, especially after seeing or experiencing horrific injuries. And as the battle wore on, your mind would begin to play tricks on you. The medieval battlefield wasn't just a test of physical strength. It was a mental nightmare that few were prepared for. As the battle raged on, something strange happened to fighters' minds, something that training couldn't prevent and that bravery couldn't overcome. Where am I? This question haunted many fighters after just 10 minutes of combat. The constant movement, the spinning to face threats from all sides, and the lack of clear sightlines meant that many soldiers quickly lost their sense of direction. Without modern communication systems, units became separated and disorganized. You'd stagger, lost in the fray, your heart racing as you realized you were cut off from your line. Studies of battle accounts reveal that approximately 60% of medieval soldiers couldn't identify which direction they were facing after the initial clash. This explains why some battles ended with both sides accidentally retreating from each other. The world's most deadly game of, you go first. Is that guy with me or against me? Recognizing friend from foe became nearly impossible once the fighting started in earnest. While armies often wore identifying colors or symbols, these quickly became covered in mud, blood, and dust. In the panic of battle, soldiers sometimes struck down their own allies by mistake. Records from the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 show that as many as 1 in 10 casualties may have come from friendly forces, with hundreds or thousands of fighters swirling around the battlefield. You'd freeze, horrified, as you struck an ally, his dying glare branding your soul with guilt. Split-second decisions often had deadly consequences. Is this my blood? A terrifying moment came when you noticed you were covered in blood, but couldn't tell if it was yours, your enemies, or your friends. You'd paw at your chest, panic rising, unsure if the red was your life draining away. Blood splatter from nearby kills could cover you head to toe, making it impossible to know if you were wounded without taking time to check. Time you didn't have when someone was trying to bash your head in. Many fighters described the surreal experience of being drenched in blood, yet unharmed, while others didn't notice serious wounds until they felt lightheaded from blood loss. Do I swing now, or just keep ducking? Combat decisions became almost automatic as the battle wore on. The conscious mind couldn't process information quickly enough to make thoughtful choices. Instead, fighters relied on muscle memory and instinct. Training exercises drilled into soldiers over and over again would take over. Like a dance routine your body remembers, even when your mind goes blank. Those who survived battles often reported having no memory of specific actions they took. Their bodies fought while their minds went elsewhere. You'd swing blindly, your mind numb, as if someone else wielded your blade through the haze. It's like when you drive home and suddenly realize you don't remember the last 10 minutes of the trip. Except instead of missing a turn, you might have stabbed 7 people. The human brain simply wasn't designed to handle the stress of medieval combat. Fear, rage, and confusion took turns driving behavior, with little room for strategic thinking. Modern studies of how the brain processes extreme stress show that higher cognitive functions shut down under threat, leaving only the most basic survival instincts active. For medieval fighters, this meant their carefully planned battle tactics often gave way to primal responses within minutes. You'd start swinging at shapes rather than people. As exhaustion and stress mounted, vision could narrow to a tunnel. Instead of seeing whole people, fighters began to react only to movement and basic shapes. A flash of metal, a blur of color, something coming from the left. Friend or foe became irrelevant in the state. If it moved toward you, you struck at it. Records from medieval battle survivors consistently mention this odd detachment, where other humans stopped looking like humans and became just threats or obstacles. You'd lash out at shadows, your mind fraying, no longer sure what you were even fighting for. After enough minutes of this sensory overload, the body would move on its own, while thoughts became just white noise. Modern combat psychologists call this battle mind, a state where action precedes conscious thought. In this altered state, fighters reported feeling disconnected from their bodies, as if watching themselves fight from a distance. Time stretched or compressed, with some soldiers recalling minutes of combat that witnesses said lasted hours, or hours that passed in what felt like moments. This mental disorientation made battle even more chaotic than it already was, and when it became too much to bear, many chose the one option that actually made perfect sense. History books glorify last stands. Movies show heroic soldiers fighting to the death. The reality: most medieval soldiers had a more sensible approach. When things got bad, they ran. Battlefield records show that about 40% of medieval armies would flee before combat reached its peak. This wasn't seen as shameful by ordinary soldiers. The shame came from nobles and knights like Edric, with reputations to protect. Peasant fighters followed the "I'd like to see my family again" principle. Medieval foot soldiers had a saying: "The graveyard is full of heroes, the tavern is full of runners." Battles often ended because one side panicked first. Once a few people started running, it created a chain reaction. The Battle of Crécy featured several moments where English forces broke, ran, regrouped, and returned before the final out. Many fighters would play dead, fake injuries, or beg for mercy when cornered. Some hid behind horses or wagons. One Norman soldier survived by crawling inside a dead horse for hours. You'd choke on the reek, your stomach heaving, as you prayed your gruesome shelter held until nightfall. Not exactly the heroic tale you'd tell your grandchildren. Running away had its own dangers. Comrades might cut you down for deserting, and in heavy armor, running any distance was exhausting. Many knights were caught simply because they ran out of breath after 100 yards. You'd stumble, lungs burning, knowing each step could end with a blade in your back. Those who did successfully escape often found that victory wasn't about glory. It was much simpler than that. When we think of victory in war movies, we see cheering soldiers, waving flags, and heroic speeches. Medieval reality: far less Instagrammable. If you were still standing when the dust settled, congratulations, you won. That was pretty much the only victory criteria. No elaborate ceremony, no medals, just the profound relief of not being dead yet. It was basically the world's deadliest game of musical chairs. When the fighting stopped, whoever was still standing got the prize of continued existence. No dramatic cheering erupted when battles ended. Most survivors were too exhausted, injured, or traumatized to celebrate. Battlefields after fighting were eerily quiet places, with fighters simply sitting down where they stood, too drained to speak. The typical victory cheer wasn't huzzah, but more like "thank God it's over. Does anyone have water?" You'd collapse, trembling, haunted by the faces of those you'd killed to survive another day. The immediate aftermath focused on practical matters. You wiped blood off your face, hopefully not yours, and checked for wounds you hadn't noticed. You looked for your friends and collected usable weapons from the ground. Medieval post-battle checklists were simple: arms still attached, legs still work. Friends, some missing. Enemies, more missing. You'd snatch a fallen sword, your hands shaking, fearing a straggler might still lurk nearby. Overall, a good day. The field became a grim marketplace after battle. Valuable armor was stripped from the dead, regardless of which side they fought for. Even boots were taken from corpses if they looked better than yours. You'd wrestle off a dead man's helm, your gut churning, knowing his lifeless eyes judged your theft. Medieval recycling programs were way ahead of their time. Nothing went to waste, especially if it was shiny or still had a good edge. You celebrated by drinking whatever alcohol was available to dull both physical and mental pain. One French chronicler noted after a major battle that the men drank for 3 days without pause, as if trying to drown what they had seen in cups of ale. Medieval victory parties were less "we are the champions" and more "please help me forget everything through the magic of fermentation." Medical tents became crowded with the wounded. Field hospitals had mortality rates between 25 and 50%. Medieval hospital waiting rooms had just 2 categories: might live and probably won't. Your category largely depended on whether the surgeon had gotten enough sleep the night before. The physical aftermath lingered for days. Bruises appeared where you didn't remember being hit. Sleep came with difficulty, interrupted by sudden movements to block attacks that weren't there. You'd bolt awake, sweating, reliving the moment a mace grazed your skull, your heart pounding. Nothing says successful warrior, quite like punching the air in your sleep and accidentally giving your spouse a black eye, while fighting an enemy who died 3 years ago. And somewhere in the mud, a broken helmet sat crooked on a stick. Medieval battlefields were rarely cleaned. They simply grew over with occasional bits of metal working their way to the surface centuries later. What movies called victory was really just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One fought not against enemies, but against pain, loss, and the knowledge of what humans could do to each other when ordered to.